The microphone feedback squealed across the St. Regis ballroom, sealing the exact second my father-in-law pointed his crystal champagne flute directly at me in front of 300 investors and said the words I had been waiting 4 years to hear. "We took this girl in out of charity," he announced, his voice amplified through the PA system they'd rented for the IPO celebration, his face flushed pink from 2 hours of open-bar Moet. "Her father fixes fences and hauls lumber in some forgotten county in Oregon. We dressed her up, put her in our family, gave her a Whitmore name. And what does she give us in return? She questions our numbers." The laughter came in waves. Some people looked at their drinks. A few didn't bother hiding their smiles. I stood 12 feet from the podium, holding a glass of sparkling water, wearing a 3-year-old navy dress. I'd hemmed myself because my mother-in-law had told me the week before that the company clothing budget wasn't meant to cover every stray Bradford brought home. My left shoe had a small scuff on the toe that I'd tried to cover with a black marker that morning. I didn't look away. I didn't look down. I leaned toward my husband and said, very quietly, just loud enough for him to hear, "The HUD escrow accounts are short by $28 million. The federal auditors already have a preliminary flag on the Calumet Heights filing. If you go forward with this IPO tomorrow morning, you will be committing securities fraud in front of these 300 witnesses." He turned to me slowly. His jaw was set. His eyes were flat in that particular way they got when he'd already decided what he was about to do. He grabbed my left wrist under the table and twisted it once, hard. Then he stood up, raised his right hand, and brought it down across my left cheek. The sound cut through the entire room. 300 people went silent. Someone's champagne glass stopped halfway to their lips. My husband straightened his cufflinks, looked out at the crowd, and said calmly, "I apologize for the interruption. My wife has had a difficult evening." I stood there with my cheek burning, tasting the sharp copper edge of my own blood where my teeth had caught the inside of my lip, and I thought, there it is. That's the last line they'll ever cross. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I reached into my clutch with my right hand, felt the edges of the encrypted USB drive I'd stitched into the lining 2 weeks earlier, and I let myself smile. Before I tell you what happened next, before I take you to what the next 40 minutes looked like inside that ballroom, I need to take you back 4 years. Because what my husband and his family never understood, what they could not have understood, because they never once looked at me long enough to see me clearly, is that I didn't come into their world helpless. I came in prepared. I was 30 years old when I married Bradford Whitmore. I had just completed 2 years as a forensic accountant for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, working financial fraud cases across the Midwest. I'd helped build cases that put 3 corporate executives and 1 sitting city alderman in federal prison before I turned 29. I knew what fraud looked like. I knew how to find it. I knew how to document it in a way that made it impossible to explain away in a courtroom. I met my husband at a conference in downtown Chicago. He was charming in the way that people with inherited money often are, effortless, polished, certain of their welcome in any room. He told me I was the most interesting person he'd spoken to in 3 years. I should have understood that for what it was. I drove a 2009 Subaru with a cracked rear bumper. My father drove a 12-year-old pickup with a lumber rack and a dog named Biscuit who rode in the back. My husband saw those things and made a judgment that permanently blinded him to everything else. My father's name is Howard Callahan. He grew up in Tillamook County, Oregon, the son of a timberman. He wore flannel shirts and Red Wing boots and could rebuild a truck engine in a single afternoon. He also held a law degree from Yale, had clerked for 2 Supreme Court justices, and had spent the last 11 years serving as Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit, one of the most powerful judicial appointments in the country below the Supreme Court itself. My grandfather had built a timber and energy company that, by the time he passed, had grown into a family trust holding just under $200 million in assets, managed quietly and deliberately out of a law office in Portland that looked like it belonged to a small-town estate attorney. My father never announced any of this. He didn't need to. He drove his pickup to the diner on Saturday mornings and called the waitress by name and tipped 30%. That was who he was. The rest was just paperwork. My father-in-law met him twice. Both times he looked at the truck and the flannel and formed a conclusion so complete and comfortable that he never revisited it once. On the night of my engagement dinner at the Whitmore home on Lakeshore Drive, my father-in-law sat at the head of a 12-seat dining table and waited until the salad course to say, with genuine warmth, as though he were paying me a compliment, "We're glad Bradford found someone. Even if the match is a little uneven." He chuckled. My mother-in-law touched her pearls. My husband refilled his wine glass without looking at me. I set down my fork, I noted the comment, I moved on. What my husband and his family never knew, what I had discovered 6 weeks before that engagement dinner, was that Whitmore Real Estate Group was committing federal housing fraud on a significant scale. I hadn't been looking for it deliberately. I found it the way you find most things in forensic accounting, by looking at a number that doesn't quite balance and pulling the thread. My husband had given me access to their accounting software under the pretense of having me review their personal tax filings, a gesture he framed as trust and that I accepted as information. What I found inside those files was a systematic pattern of diverted escrow funds across 14 federally subsidized housing developments in the Chicago metro area. Construction escrow accounts, money that was legally required to be paid out to subcontractors and materials suppliers, were being rerouted through a shell company called Meridian Build Group LLC, registered in Delaware with no employees, no physical address, and a bank account in the Cayman Islands attached to my husband's personal taxpayer identification number. $28 million over 4 years. Hundreds of subcontractors had been left with unpaid invoices and incomplete mechanics liens. A dozen low-income families in the Calumet Heights development had moved into buildings with plumbing and electrical work that had never been properly finished because the contractors who were supposed to complete it had never been paid. I could have walked away from the engagement. I almost did. I sat in the parking garage of my husband's office building for 45 minutes with my hands on the steering wheel, thinking through what I was looking at. But I knew that if I dissolved the relationship and reported it anonymously, the money would be moved, the accounts would be restructured, and the trail I was looking at would disappear within 30 days. The subcontractors would never be made whole. The families in those buildings would go on living in incomplete units, and my husband would find another way to do it again. I needed to be inside. I needed documented evidence built over time that could survive a federal prosecution. So I said yes to the proposal, and I got to work. The Whitmore household operated on a hierarchy so clearly defined that during my first week inside it, I made a map in the back of a yellow legal pad just to understand the architecture of the contempt. My father-in-law sat at the top. His opinion was the weather. It set the temperature for everyone else in the house. My mother-in-law enforced the temperature with the cheerful efficiency of someone who had been doing it so long she no longer noticed. My husband executed it. The first month, my mother-in-law presented me with a printed list, an actual printed list, on Whitmore Real Estate Group letterhead, of my expected domestic contributions to household life. This included overseeing the dry cleaning schedule, coordinating with the household staff on menu planning, and maintaining the flower arrangements in the formal living room. I had just passed the Certified Fraud Examiner examination 6 months prior. I kept the list, I did the tasks, I noted everything. Every Friday evening, my mother-in-law hosted dinner for 2 or 3 of my father-in-law's business associates, and she would introduce me, every single time, even to people I had met before, with the same construction. This is Bradford's wife. She handles some of our basic filing, keeps things organized. Then she would turn to whoever she was talking to and resume the conversation. I filed, I kept things organized. I also maintained a parallel set of encrypted financial records on a secondary laptop that I kept in a fireproof case inside a storage unit I rented in my own name in Evanston, Illinois. By the end of year 1, I had documented 37 separate wire transfers between Whitmore accounts and the Meridian Build Group shell. By the end of year 2, I had reconstructed the entire shell structure, including 3 subsidiary accounts that appeared in offshore filings my husband hadn't mentioned when he gave me access to the software. There was a night in February of year 2 when my husband came home at midnight from a shareholder dinner and found me in the kitchen with a cup of cold coffee and a legal notepad. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the notepad, looking at me. He said, "What are you working on?" I said, "Your mother's holiday expense report. She wants the categories reorganized." He looked at me for 3 more seconds, then he went to bed. I sat in the kitchen until 2 in the morning and added 6 more entries to the encrypted ledger I was building in Evanston. Once a month, on the 3rd Sunday, I drove north and met my father for breakfast at a diner near the lake in Evanston called The Anchor. He always came alone, in the same clothes, a gray Henley, canvas work pants, boots. He looked exactly like what my father-in-law had decided he was, an old man with rough hands who belonged to a different era. My brother Reed joined when he could. He was a partner at a federal litigation firm in Washington, D.C., the kind of firm with 3 names on the door and a client list that didn't need advertising. He wore suits that cost more than my husband's watch, but he had our father's eyes, sharp and still in a way that didn't announce itself. I would slide into the booth across from them and feel something unknot in my chest. I didn't have to perform anything. I could just sit. My father would study my face. He always noticed things before I said them, The tension I carried in my jaw from keeping my expression neutral during my father-in-law's dinner table commentary, the slight inflammation in my left wrist from the times my husband grabbed it, the particular kind of tired that doesn't come from sleep deprivation but from sustained emotional discipline. He never told me to leave. He understood strategy. He understood that sometimes you hold a position not because you're trapped in it, but because that position is the most effective place from which to finish the job. He would slide his coffee mug an inch toward me, his version of a handshake, and say simply, "How much more do you need?" And I would tell him, precisely like a briefing. By the middle of year 3, my brother had prepared the federal civil complaint, the IRS referral documentation, and the HUD Inspector General filing. All of it was sitting in a sealed folder in his office, safe in DC, waiting for my signature on the authorization to file. I told them the same thing every time they asked. Not yet. They're planning an IPO. I want them at their most exposed. My father nodded both times without argument. When you spend 4 decades in federal law, you develop a particular patience with the concept of timing. The last time I saw him before the IPO event, he pressed a small device into my palm across the table, a discreet digital recorder no larger than a car key fob, already paired to a secure cloud account my brother administered. He said quietly, "One more month. You've built something solid. Don't let them pull you off course in the final stretch." I drove back to the city, with the recorder in my pocket and the windows down, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 3 years. The specific calm of a person who knows exactly what they're doing and exactly when they're going to use it. The morning of the IPO celebration, my mother-in-law came into the kitchen while I was making coffee and told me that the tailor had returned my dress alterations on the wrong garment, so I would need to find something else to wear to the party. She said this with casual precision, in the way she delivered most things she had arranged on purpose. I wore the navy dress I'd hemmed myself. I stitched the encrypted USB drive into the inner lining while my mother-in-law was on the phone with the caterer downstairs. Before we left for the St. Regis, my husband called me into his home office and locked the door behind him with a definitive click. He had a 4-page document on his desk. He slid it toward me without preamble and said, "Sign this." It was a personal liability guarantee. In the event of any regulatory action against Whitmore Real Estate Group, the document would designate me as the primary liability officer, shifting personal financial responsibility for up to $35 million in potential penalties and fines onto my name alone. I looked at the document. I looked at him. He said, "Sign it now or you don't come tonight, and I'll close the joint accounts by Monday." I reached into the cuff of my sleeve and activated the recorder. I said, with careful neutrality, "The document references a liability exposure of $35 million, but the HUD compliance gap I've been tracking in the Calumet Heights escrow accounts only accounts for $28 million. Where does the additional $7 million originate?" He slammed his palm flat on the desk, his face darkened. "The $7 million is from the Sheffield Park renovation advances I diverted through Meridian in the 3rd quarter, he said. His voice was loud and fast, the way people speak when they want a conversation to be over. "Nobody finds it unless you tell them. Sign the document, or I will make your life considerably worse than it already is." I said, with wide, frightened eyes that I had practiced until they looked completely real, "Of course, give me a moment." I reached for the pen. I wrote a small, careful spiral on the signature line, not my name, but a mark that looked, from a distance, like one. He didn't look closely. He tucked the document into his briefcase and straightened his jacket. The cloud upload confirmation blinked once on the recorder in my sleeve. My brother had my husband's full confession in his possession before we reached the elevator. In the car on the way to the St. Regis, my father-in-law raised his champagne glass and told my husband, with the settled confidence of a man who had never considered being wrong about anything that mattered, "Tomorrow morning, son, will be the most talked about name in Chicago real estate. And not a soul in that ballroom has any idea how we got here." I sat across from them and watched my own face in the tinted window. My expression was completely still. I had already sent the activation signal to my brother from the parking garage of our building. The IRS Criminal Investigation Team and the FBI Financial Crimes Unit were positioned in vehicles on Michigan Avenue. All I needed was for my father-in-law to cross the last line. He crossed it 12 minutes into his keynote toast when he pointed at me in front of 300 investors and called me a charity case from an Oregon lumber yard. And my husband made it complete when he raised his hand. The burning in my cheek did not break me, it freed me. I stood up straight, squared my shoulders, and reached into my clutch. I pulled out my phone, pressed the single speed dial number I'd had programmed for 6 months, and raised it to my ear while my husband stared at me with an expression that was trying to decide whether to look amused or alarmed. My father answered on the second ring. His voice was even and quiet, the voice of a man who has spent decades making rulings that change people's lives and who understands the weight of every word. The room was silent enough that I didn't need to project. "Dad," I said. "They just crossed the final line, it's time." A pause of exactly 2 seconds. "Reed's team is already moving," he said. "I'll see you inside." I ended the call. I walked past my husband without looking at him, crossed to the AV console at the side of the stage, and plugged the encrypted USB drive into the presentation port. The main screen above the stage, the 80-inch display they'd been using all evening to show Whitmore Real Estate Group's projected revenue growth, filled with a spreadsheet, wire transfer records, Meridian Build Group LLC, $28 million, organized by transaction date, source account, and destination routing number in the Cayman Islands. I pressed the second file. My husband's voice came through the ballroom's surround sound system at full volume. "The $7 million is from the Sheffield Park renovation advances I diverted through Meridian in the third quarter." The room went completely still. My father-in-law's mouth opened, my mother-in-law set down her champagne glass. My husband spun toward the console and lunged forward. An FBI special agent in a dark suit stepped from the service corridor and stopped him before he reached the AV table. 2 more agents were behind him within seconds. The main doors opened. 12 federal agents moved into the room in tight, purposeful formation, FBI Financial Crimes and IRS Criminal Investigation Division, badges clipped and visible, spreading quickly and quietly to the exits. The crowd compressed against the walls. Walking in behind them was my brother Reed. He was in his federal litigation suit, charcoal gray with a fine chalk stripe, the one he wore when he wanted rooms to understand immediately that he was not there to negotiate. He carried a leather portfolio in one hand and a stack of court filings in the other. He walked down the center aisle of that ballroom at an unhurried pace, nodded once to me, and handed my father-in-law the asset freeze injunction from the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois, signed that afternoon by a federal magistrate judge. My father-in-law read the cover page. He looked up at my brother slowly. He said, with the particular dignity of a man whose dignity had just collapsed beneath him, "Who are you?" My brother said, "I'm the attorney of record for the complainant. My name is Reed Callahan." My father-in-law blinked. He said slowly, "Callahan, that's her name." "Yes," my brother said, "it is." The back doors of the ballroom opened a second time. The crowd, which had been moving toward the exits in nervous clusters, stopped. My father walked in. He was wearing his judicial robe over a white dress shirt. The robe was black with the gold trim of the Seventh Circuit, the buttons running straight and precise down the front. He was 63 years old, 6 feet 2, with hands that were rough from decades of weekend work on his property in Oregon, and gray eyes that were steady in the way of someone who has made very large decisions for a very long time. He walked down the center aisle at the same measured pace he had always used for everything. The sound his boots made on the marble floor was the kind of sound that rooms pay attention to without knowing why. My father-in-law, who had dismissed this man as an aging laborer with a lumber truck, took one step backward until his spine was against the podium. My father stopped at the base of the stage. He looked at my father-in-law for a long, quiet moment. Then he spoke clearly, without raising his voice. "My name is Howard Callahan. I am Chief Judge of the United States Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit. 2 hours ago, I signed the emergency judicial authorization enabling the federal asset freeze on Whitmore Real Estate Group, its 17 subsidiary LLCs, and all personal accounts attached to your family's taxpayer identification numbers." He paused for exactly as long as necessary. "You called me a man who hauls lumber. You called my daughter a charity case. I want you to understand something, Mr. Whitmore. She is the reason you are not being arraigned in the dark. She built this case inside your own walls, and she gave you a public ending. That was more than you deserved." The room was so quiet I could hear the ice settling in someone's abandoned glass. My father climbed the stage steps, stood beside me, and held out his hand. In his palm was a small electronic signature device, the authorization touchpad for the receivership transfer documents my brother had spent 18 months preparing. I took the stylus. I looked down at the screen. The document named the transferred corporate assets and their designated new purpose: a rehabilitation fund for the subcontractors and families defrauded by the Calumet Heights and Sheffield Park projects. Hundreds of contractors who had completed work and never been paid. Families who had moved into federally subsidized housing and found the walls unfinished. Behind me, my husband was on his knees on the carpet. I could hear his voice somewhere at the edge of my attention, something about our marriage, about starting over, about all the things he would do differently. His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, thin and frantic, like a structure becoming aware of its own collapse. I didn't turn around. I pressed the stylus to the screen and signed my name, my full legal name, the one I had carried my whole life, the one that had never actually belonged to any of them, in one clean, unhurried line. The Whitmore Real Estate Group logo dissolved from the main screen. In its place, the federal receivership seal appeared in blue and gold. 300 people who had come to celebrate an IPO watched the Whitmore family's empire close in the same ballroom where it had tried to reduce a woman to a footnote. A woman who had spent 4 years quietly building the case that ended them. My mother-in-law sat down in a banquet chair with both hands over her face. An IRS agent stood quietly nearby. My husband stopped talking. An IRS agent read him his Miranda rights. The words were brisk and practiced and fell into the ballroom like stones into still water. A week later, I sat on the steps of my father's property in Tillamook County, Oregon. The morning fog was still threaded through the Douglas firs. Biscuit, the current Biscuit, the third dog to carry the name in my lifetime, was asleep in the dry grass beside the porch. I was wearing jeans and one of my father's old flannels, and I was drinking black coffee, and I was thinking about almost nothing. My brother had sent the case summary the night before. The HUD Inspector General's office had confirmed full recovery proceedings on behalf of the defrauded subcontractors. 11 of the 14 affected families in the Calumet Heights development had already been contacted by the Federal Housing Liaison. My husband and my father-in-law had both entered not guilty pleas, which their defense attorneys had quietly advised them would likely be reconsidered once the scope of the documentation became clear. My divorce filing had been accepted without contest. I wasn't wearing the engagement ring. I'd left it on the bathroom counter of the St. Regis the night of the arrest, just set it down on a piece of hotel stationery and walked out. It felt accurate. My father came out onto the porch with his own coffee and sat in the wooden chair beside me. We didn't speak for a while. The fog moved through the treetops and the air smelled like rain and cedar. After a long time, he said, "You did something difficult the hard way, on purpose, because it was the only way to make it stick." "I know," I said. "Most people would have walked away and called it self-preservation. I know that too." He looked at the tree line. He said, "I'm proud of you, not because of the outcome, because of what you held on to while you were in it." I thought about that for a while. About 4 years of keeping my expression neutral at my father-in-law's dinner table. The receipts I had to submit in writing, itemized for basic household groceries. My mother-in-law's voice telling people at dinner parties that I handled some of the basic filing. My husband's hand on my wrist twisting. I thought about driving north to Evanston every third Sunday and sliding into the booth across from my father and my brother and feeling the part of me they had tried to grind down come back online the moment I sat down. I thought about my husband on his knees on the ballroom carpet, talking about starting over, and the silence I had held in response without a second's hesitation. The fog was thinning. You could see the shape of the hills beginning to emerge behind it. "What happens now?" my father asked. I had a job offer sitting in my email from the HUD Office of Inspector General, a senior investigative role I'd been quietly approached about 8 months earlier, before any of this had concluded. I had time to answer it properly now. "I go back to work," I said. He nodded once and reached over and knocked his coffee mug lightly against mine. That was enough. The hardest thing about surviving a system that tries to make you small is not the system itself. It's holding on to the knowledge, through every dinner table comment and every long night in that storage unit in Evanston, and every moment when the easier choice was right there in front of you, that your size was never actually up for debate. They thought they were measuring me. The whole time, I was measuring them. I knew the number, I knew where every dollar had gone, and I knew exactly when to make the call.